may not see from the title of this video, I'd been thinking about for a while about how to kind of make a video for people who have no idea how to get into classical music, or may be confused by the plethora of stuff that's out there and don't really have a good starting place to begin listening to this stuff. I wanted to make a video for those people, or anybody who wanted to learn about classical music in general, kind of talking about how they can get started learning about classical music. Because if we're all being honest here, classical music is a huge genre. It's a huge genre of music, just full of composers and styles, and it's more than enough music than one person can listen to in their entire lifetime. So there's no possible way for anybody to listen to anything and know how they're gonna find stuff that they're gonna like. So I wanted to make at least a video, or maybe a series of videos, kind of talking through how people get started on that journey and what they can do to kind of get this foundational knowledge to set them in a certain direction that they may want to go. And the more I started thinking about this, the more I realized that this is quite the complicated topic, and that it's something that we don't really have very well in our academic system. Basically, what I mean is that in some ways, our music education that we get from schools kind of fails us. And I say this as someone who has gone through the education to become a music teacher. So I know what music teachers have to deal with, and I know what music teachers, their requirements are in order to teach students. And the problem often comes down to the fact that music education is both somewhat standardized and really not standardized at all. And so what ends up happening is that music teachers are often left with a lot of freedom to do whatever it is they want, and then that kind of gives them the entirety of all music ever to kind of just teach to students. Teachers are often just kind of told, here you go, teach fourth graders about music. What kind of music? I don't know, whatever you think is best. Whatever you think is gonna work well for them. But yet at the same time, sometimes standards are implemented. Students have to have these certain set of skills when it comes to music. They should understand certain kinds of concepts and overarching ideas, but it's all still really kind of vague and general, and there's nothing foundational to apply these skills to. It's just kind of skills that float around in the air that are often then lost and no longer cared about once you reach, you know, middle school and high school, when the school system also stops caring about music education. But there are so many people who come back years later into their adulthood going, you know, I've started listening to classical music and I really want to know where to get started. I had no idea I would enjoy this kind of stuff. I had no idea what was out there. And I really like this a lot more than I originally thought I would, or more than I thought I would back when I was in elementary school, when we were listening to it just to play those awful recorders. So what oftentimes ends up happening instead is that students are taught maybe how to play recorder, how to play piano, a few of the major composers, some basic concepts about music, and just bobs and bits of information that are not really tied to anything concrete and give the students no motivation to want to learn more. Now, fixing that problem is a whole entire issue in and of itself that I won't address in this video. The education system has enough problems, or at least when I'm saying education system, I mean the American education system for my context. But it has enough problems by itself as is, and I'm not going to try to sit here in this video and explain what I think needs fixed with that. What I'm going to do instead is offer a solution to everybody else who was perhaps given a lackluster music education, whether it's the fault of their music teachers or their school systems, or maybe you just didn't pay enough attention like you wanted to back in the day, and you want to make up for lost time. Whoever you are, and whatever it is, if you are interested in getting a start and learning about classical music, this is the video for you. So, let's answer that question. Where do we start? There's so much stuff to learn about. Where do we even think to begin? There's it could fill up library upon library upon library of just information and pieces and all this other stuff. So instead of just watching a bunch of random YouTube videos and going down a bunch of rabbit holes of certain people's YouTube channels where they just make a bunch of videos about random bits and bobbles about music history, let's actually get some foundation on this, shall we? I think the best way we can accomplish this goal is to start by understanding the eras of music history. That's going to help because especially when we're talking classical music is historical art music, generally speaking. And so in order to understand this music that comes from history in the past, we have to understand where it fits into the context of various eras and genres in the timeline that it exists in. So having a general understanding of the various music history eras, we can understand individual pieces a lot better because they're pieces to a larger puzzle that we can fit in and understand how it all works together in tandem. So in this video, I'm going to go over the whole overarching eras of music history. I'm not going to go into anything too terribly in depth because there's still so much information to comb through. Instead, I'm going to give a big starting point and just kind of name the various eras, really generic characteristics and things you absolutely should need to know. Then, after this, I plan on kind of turning this into a mini-series where I go through each of the various eras that I've listed here in this video, and I talk about key characteristics, what kinds of styles of pieces were coming out, who were the major composers, just more detailed information so that you can then take that and use that as a bouncing off point to lead you in more directions to start to know where to go. If you don't have that foundational knowledge of how everything fits together, there is no possible way you can understand everything as a whole. There's no possible way you can understand classical music as a whole. It's just too daunting of a task. So instead, I'm going to use this mini-series to break things down into more bite-sized pieces, to make it more digestible and understandable. And even though you won't get every last little detail, you should at least be able to digest it better, if you will. Yeah. So, without further ado, let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. So, first up, we have ancient music. I'm going to start here, even though I'm not going to make a video on this era, because it's important to know that it exists. It's important to know what kind of came before. Sort of how, like, if we learn about history in our history class, we start at a certain point, but we know there was prehistory before that. That's kind of what ancient music is. The rough kind of ending point of when ancient music is can really vary depending on which kind of music scholar you're asking, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to say about 900. Not 900 BC, just 900. The year 900 is kind of when ancient music sort of stops. Obviously, with all of these eras, there's a lot of crossover. Just because we have a set date in mind for when this era sort of ended, that doesn't mean people stopped composing styles of the old genre. And it doesn't mean people didn't start until that point. In fact, I'm going to list a lot of dates for these eras, and you're probably going to look them up, and they're probably going to be wrong. They're probably going to be 5 years off or 10 years off. It really depends on how you're defining it and who you're asking and how that person that you're asking is defining it and all this other kinds of stuff. There is no, I mean, it's like in your life. How do you know when you transition from one thing to the next to the next? It's a transition. Sometimes there's transitional periods, sometimes there's very cut and clear answers. And that's what a lot of these eras are. But to simplify things down, I'm going to give rough dates so that you know about when I'm talking about. So for ancient music, we're gonna say it's all of prehistory up until about 900. Now with ancient music, it's all, well, actually, we really don't know a lot about ancient music because during this time, music really wasn't being written down. A lot of it throughout many cultures was a very oral and oral tradition. And so you would listen to it and you would copy it just by what you heard. There's nothing comprehensive to read like what we have oftentimes with our music today. Music was often relatively simple as far as we can tell. Again, like, we don't have a ton of records to know what they did. We more so have the various instruments that were used during this time period. But in terms of what this music specifically sounded like, it is very, very, very rare that we have anything tangible that we can know what music prior to, like I said, roughly 900 sounded like. The next era that we have is medieval music. Now, I've talked about medieval music before on this channel, and I did a video where I compared medieval music to modern bardcore music and kind of comparing and contrasting how they're similar and how they differ. But true, honest to goodness medieval music ranged from about that 900 period to about up to 1500. This era often coincides with what we think of when we think of medieval Europe. And the music reflects a lot of the art styles we might also see from here. Music is somewhat simplistic. It's not horribly awful, terribly simplistic, but it's a lot more toned down than the stuff that will come later on. Music existed in both a choral sense and an instrumental sense, but most of what we have exists in the choral kind of sphere. And again, a lot of that is because the earliest parts of medieval music weren't really being written down until a writing system started formally coming into place. During the medieval era is when we really start to see a system of writing down music be created and mostly standardized. The biggest reason why we started writing down music was because it was during this time when the churches were using a lot of music for their church services and needed a way to teach up-and-coming monks how to perform the songs, how to sing the songs, and how to basically put on the church services because the music was the church service. And it's kind of inconvenient to have to sing through it and have everybody repeat it. If you've ever learned anything by rote, you'll know it is actually much slower to learn by rote than it is to read something and play it. So various systems came up throughout various times in the medieval era, but eventually it all started converging together and we did eventually turn out the written system that we have today, even if it didn't look exactly the same back then as it does right now. Other things that really started coming out is solfege. So if you've ever been in choir, this is where solfege starts becoming a thing. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, do. Even for me, it's sometimes hard to still do those hand signals. And like I said, a lot of the music during this time period is mostly kind of slow and simple and not nearly as complex as later eras of music history would end up becoming. This is also where a lot of Gregorian chant exists. So when you think of that old ancient music of medieval era, yes, Gregorian chant did come from medieval era music. A lot of the music is pretty monophonic, meaning there's only one note singing at a time. There's not too much polyphony with lots of melodic lines singing all at once until more later on into the medieval era. Instruments virtually were non-existent, at least in the written music that we have. Most of this is due to the church. The church didn't really like much instruments and rhythm at all because it kind of associated it with more paganistic beliefs and dancing and thought that was not God's way, basically. So that was a huge, big wah wah in the church, so we don't see a lot of it in written down music. And because there wasn't a ton of rhythm, the choral music often reflected that, so it tends to move very slowly. We don't want to feel any kind of distinct beat in this music, because what if it starts making what people want to dance, and that's very sinful and bad. So music moves very slow, and we can't have a lot of voices all at once because it's kind of hard to keep everything together when you don't have a distinct beat coming out. Moving on to the Renaissance period. Now, a lot of times when we hear medieval music in like movies and stuff, what we're actually hearing is more Renaissance music. That's because Renaissance music tends to sound prettier than medieval music. But you know what? I don't blame them. Renaissance music is one of my favorite types of music. I said in my last video that Impressionism was one of my favorite. Here's my other favorite. It's Renaissance music, especially in the choral sense, because choral music reigned supreme in the Renaissance era. It was all over the place. Now, instruments were more prominent during this time period than they were in the medieval era. We were using them more. However, you're not going to see it being written down in music, because now we're writing down our music, yay! But we're not writing down the instrumental parts. It was more implied. Polyphony also became much more prominent during this time period. So before, we had Gregorian chants, very monophonic, very one voice line at a time. Polyphony starts really growing and developing and starting to really become crazy during this whole time period. So instead of having one melody line, now we have 4 or 5, and they're all singing together all at once to create a big cacophony of sound that somehow sounds so amazingly beautiful. Dissonance, because of the polyphony, also became a lot more common. Prior to this, there were certain intervals that were meant to be avoided because they kind of brought on the devil. They were the devil's intervals. I don't know. Medieval Europe was a very weird place. But now dissonance is becoming accepted and taken up, and especially with all the polyphonic music that we have, it's inevitable that these voices are going to crash into each other and mesh with each other and just create these beautiful, beautiful, crunchy chords. But they're not chords yet because that concept hasn't existed yet. We will get to that in a second. Composing techniques became a lot more complex here too, because composers would write up a melody line and then decide, I think I want to take this and flip it around. I want to turn it upside down. I want to invert it backwards. I want to flip it all around and do all these gymnastics with it. And we know these to be various specific named composing techniques now, but back then they didn't really know what they were doing. They were just kind of experimenting without giving anything specific names at the time. But because of this, it gives the music of this time period a much more complex and intricate kind of sound. Music of this time period was still kind of split into the two camps of sacred and secular like they were before, but unlike a lot more medieval music, sacred and secular were about 50-50 in terms of what you'll hear. So back in the medieval era, it's mostly sacred music that we're finding and seeing, at least in terms of what's being written down. Now in the Renaissance era, it's about 50-50 in terms of sacred to secular music. If you were a composer during this time period, you were most likely going to be employed by a church or some kind of nobility. That's how you made money. And you didn't really go out and I'm just gonna write this song and sell it for money and see who buys it. That's not how things worked back then. There wasn't enough exchange of information for you to just be able to get your music out there. So you often worked for a church, constantly writing sacred music, or you worked for a noble person where you were constantly writing music for them. Unless you were someone lucky, say like Carlo Gesualdo, who was just his own freaking rich prince who already had an inheritance, so he could just write music however he wanted to. Music of this time period is also very segregated into the countries that it was being written in. Basically, there was an idea of Italian music versus German music versus English music versus French music, and so on and so forth. To the people of the time period, these various countries' musics did sound distinct and similar. To our own modern ears, who are more used to globalization and such a diverse mix of music, that Renaissance music by itself all tends to blur together and sound the same, it's more easily understood as kind of like a composing concept. So if you're going to write a madrigal, that's only going to be from Italy. If you're going to write a chanson, that's only going to be from France. And so, although they may sound very similar to us as we're listening to it, it's good to know that if it has a certain type of title, that usually it's very associated with a certain country. You're not going to find an Italian composer too often composing German-specific songs, or a French composer composing English-specific songs, and so on and so forth. It can happen, and there are plenty of examples of it happening, but because travel was much harder back in the day and people couldn't travel long distances as easily as we can now, you tended to stay in your own area and what you were familiar with. Then we move on to the Baroque era, and this is ranging from about 1600 to 1750. Now, most people will cut this off at 1750 because that's the year that Bach died. And we kind of associate Bach so much with the Baroque era that it's kind of easy to cut off the Baroque era right at his death. However, the Baroque era started long before Bach did. And so, of course, we're coming off these Renaissance vibes and we're going into the Baroque era, and things only start to get more complex. In fact, the name Baroque was given to this era by its later, I want to say predecessors, its predecessors? That might not be a word. But anyways, it was kind of given to the Baroque era as a way to make fun of it and saying it's really crazy and really complex and really, really intricate, because it really starts to go that way. It doesn't start off that way, but once we get further and further and further down the line and we kind of hit that middle point of the Baroque era, it's all over the place, because now we have polyphony left and right. Now we have ornamentation. Now people are expected to improvise on their own. You don't just see a piece of music and just play it as is. You have to add in your own ornamentation and just add in all these flourishes and ornamentals, and you have to make every last single inch of it hyper fancy. It's insane. It gets insane. And I understand why people don't like this era as much, because I'm not a huge fan of it all the time. Sometimes. It's also in this era that we start to see composing rules start to become into place. This is where we start to develop the idea of a chord. This is what a chord is. This is where we start to have the idea of being in a key signature. Before we had church modes, but we weren't too concerned about what our key signature was. Now we start to develop the idea of key signatures and chords, and this is where a lot of, think sort of like Bach's chorales. It's all these notes all together playing the same rhythm, but all on different notes. That's where that kind of chordal idea starts to come into place. This is also the era of opera. This is where opera really starts to take off and just goes crazy. This is also the era where we start to see that the first few glimmers of the diva and the vocalist and the solo vocalist who sings and ornaments everything and goes over the top and just everything ultra fancy. That exists in this era. Instruments also start to take more of a forward stance here. They're not always being explicitly written for at the beginning of the Baroque era, but as we go further and further and further down the line, now all of a sudden we start to develop things such as suites or concertos, which are these big, huge works which are only featuring instruments, rather than just a basso continuo line, which is where you have the choir singing and then maybe like a cello playing underneath them. But like I said, there's still a lot of improvisation. So just because your part was written out didn't mean that it was written out super clearly for you to understand every last little detail. In fact, when I've sung Baroque music in a choral setting before, we would have the choir sing, we'd have the basso continuo from a cello, and then we often had a harpsichordist who would come and just basically improv the underlying accompanying chords based on whatever we were singing. This was usually written in figured bass, but it wasn't any, like I said, no explicit notes. You were just kind of expected to figure things out on your own. And of course, polyphony is super, super, super crazy and thick during this time period. Did I mention how insane polyphony was? Because this is where we start to see things like fugues. This is where imitation goes all over the place. Like I said, our composing rules that we have to follow, not just chords that we have to create, but just like how our intervals can be, and it exists within every second of a fugue. And with fugue specifically, instead of it being chord, 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 it's melody line, melody line, melody line, melody line, and they're all going at the same time, but they have to fit together and create chords as it goes along. And still, it's so complex and complicated, and some people really like this era because of it. Me, a little less so, but again, it depends on what we're talking about, because we've still got fun things like operas and oratorios and cantatas and all this other crazy, wonderful stuff. But of course, we then move on to the classical era, which is from roughly 1750 to about 1825. And they look back on the Baroque era and they go, okay, all right, guys, we took it a step too far. We went a little overboard, and I'm kind of embarrassed of it right now. And so they really started to simplify things down. Now we focus, instead of having like 5 melodic lines playing all at once for this crazy polyphony, now we have 1 melodic line and the accompaniment underneath that. Music gets a lot cleaner sound now. There's not as much crazy stuff going on. It's a lot lighter in its feel compared to the stuff that it came before it, but especially when compared to the era that comes after it. This is also where we start to see a lot more forms popping up in music. So like ABA form, rondo form, sonata form. If you if you learned about any of this stuff during your music education career, this is mostly where a lot of those forms start to be developed and especially are featured. Instrumental music really starts to reign supreme. So before this, choral music and vocal music really had a grip on all the music as a whole. But it's here when we really start to see that the instrumental music take the big forefront and eventually dominate almost all of the music that's out there. People are still being employed by churches and nobles up until about Mozart. Mozart's one of the first people to ever start to branch out and try to make money off of writing music that's not connected to a bigger entity. Because when you're working for a church or you're working for a noble, they're telling you what to write. That's why people like Bach had such large catalogs of music. Bach was writing every single week, new piece after new piece after new piece. That is why his catalog was so huge. It's because he had to pump something out every single week. But you know, Mozart didn't really like that kind of style. He wanted to write whatever he wanted to write, and he didn't want to be told what to do. So he's one of those first people that really starts to find a way to make money that's not connected to a church or a noble in some way. Dynamics also really start to get a much bigger feature here than they were prior. It wasn't that dynamics didn't exist, they obviously existed, but certain kinds of instruments couldn't always produce them in the same way. For example, during the Baroque era, organs were really huge, but with organs you can't really change the level of dynamics. You can add more instruments and take it away, but you have to do it through pulling out stops or closing the little, I forget what they're called right now, but the little doors that blow out all the sound. It's really hard to change the dynamic level on an organ compared to, say, something like a violin. However, a lot of that starts to change in the classical era. We see dynamics being a little bit more prominent, and especially if I'm talking in terms of keyboarding music, because the piano is now been invented. So prior to the piano, the predecessor was the harpsichord, which the difference between a harpsichord and a piano is that the harpsichord has the strings and they are plucked, compared to the piano where the strings are hit. So when you hit a string, you can control how hard you hit it, which controls how loud or soft it is. Because the piano's full name is the pianoforte, the soft loud. What a creative name. And the harpsichord has one dynamic level. You can't make it louder, you can't make it softer, it's only just plucked. Violinists probably know what I'm talking about. When you pluck your strings on your violin, it doesn't do much in terms of sound. Same is true of the harpsichord. And we like this nice, pretty, clean sound, but what we really want is we really want something with a little bit more meat on its bones. So here we enter Beethoven. And Beethoven is one of those people who helps transition the classical era into the Romantic era and basically acts as the inspiration from this point on to the next era. Everybody just goes back to Beethoven to reference him constantly, because the Romantic era is all about drama. It ranges from about 1825 to about 1900, so the beginning of the 20th century. And Beethoven really helps make that transition because he takes it from very light, fluffy, clean classical music into something much darker and heavier and full of this just drama. Take, for example, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, probably the magnum opus in terms of what everybody refers to during the Romantic era as the magnum opus that all inspires everybody else. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is so over the top and so dramatic, and it's just this huge, giant, long piece, and it just gets more and more and more and more and more dramatic until the final movement, when we freaking throw in a choir into the whole song. That was something that had never been done before. Now, there's plenty of works where people sing and instruments play all at the same time, but putting a choir in a sonata was not something that anybody had ever really done before, and not too many people have done since then. It's kind of inconvenient because it's like you have to wait until the very last movement to get on stage and play everything, but it sounds amazing. It's why we use that song in almost all our commercials, is because that piece just sounds so wonderful and beautiful. And that's where our starting point and turning point is for the rest of the Romantic era. So things start to become very dramatic and very dark and full of dynamics, and it's all inspired by just this dark, dramatic, it's musical history's emo stage. Let's just be honest here. Compare it to the art and the poetry and the literature and all this other stuff that was also coming out at this time. Music is being inspired by kind of the idea of the suffering artist, because Beethoven was the pinnacle of that, him going deaf. And it's also inspired by a lot of supernatural stories, a lot of fairy tale-like stories. Think of the Brothers Grimm, which also came out during this time. I mean, just every possible thing you can imagine. I have several more videos that go into detail about these kind of things. For example, my video that I did on Der Irrkönig, that's a great example of what the storytelling and this supernatural just obsession was during this time period. Just like dark, deep, and heavy, just everything. Vocal music is starting to come back a little bit more. Operas are still present. They've been present since the Baroque era, when they really were at their height. But they're starting to come back more than they were than the classical era, because instruments were so prominent during the classical era that vocal music and choral music became almost non-existent, and opera wasn't too heavily featured that often. Opera starts to come back during the Romantic era. I mean, think of like Wagner or Rossini or Puccini, or just like all these big major operatic composers. It was a big thing during this time, but still, it's not nearly the powerhouse that instrumental music has been from the classical era and continues going basically from that point onward. Homophonic music is still pretty much at the forefront of the music that we're composing during this time period. So with that major melodic line and a lot more accompaniment underneath it, although the accompaniment is not quite as clear-cut and dry as it was in the classical era, it is a bit more interesting and there's a lot more going on with it. But for the most part, we're still seeing pretty homophonic type melodies. And then we turn to, I'm gonna call it 20th century. That's what I've always known it as. The name really depends on what you're looking at. I call it 20th century, even though it is 20th and 21st century now, because this is kind of the era that we're in. We haven't really done much to change out of this era. And even then, it's still pretty hard to define this era because it really is the era of change. I mean, we see this most predominantly with the technology. I mean, technology changes so incredibly fast and it really has a major impact on the music that we're writing. We bounce from one movement to another, from Impressionism to Primitivism to Modernism to Postmodernism to 12-tone music to Minimalism to Expressionism to just all these various movements that pop up during the time. Some of them overlap, some of them come one right after the other. And there's nothing super centralized about this time period. Obviously, again, the years of this are roughly the beginning of the 20th century to about present, and genres are really influencing one another. So jazz has its prominence during this time period, and it really has a major impact on classical music. Look at Gershwin for a great example of that. Popular music starts to be taken more seriously during this time period, and that in and of itself often influences classical music and what classical music is trying to do. World events especially so have a major impact on the music of this time period because, you know, 2 world wars, and that affects what people want to listen to and what people value and hold important. It's one thing to have this fluffy, fun, beautiful, wonderful classical music, but when your world starts crumbling around you, sometimes you just want to go back to basics. And we see many movements in the classical music sphere start to reflect those ideas. Political leaders also have a huge effect on the composers and what the composers are able to write. Shostakovich. And this is the era that I feel like if you have the hardest time understanding it, it's gonna be this era, because there is so much that goes on during this time period. And that, roughly speaking, are the major eras of music history to get you started to know where to go. Like I said, I'm going to be putting out a little mini series going forward where I'm going to talk about all those eras I just briefly mentioned. I'm going to give much more details about characteristics, much more details about various types of pieces that are prominent in the eras. I'm going to go much more into detail about who the big composers are and who you should be listening to so that you have all that information much better at your fingertips. I'm probably not going to do straight through like one right after the other because there's so many videos and I might want to take a break eventually in the middle of them. But keep your eye out if this interests you, if you like this video and you like the start of this idea that's going on. Keep your eye out because I will be posting them in the weeks following. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to subscribe if you want to see the next few videos in this series, and I hope I'll see you next time. Goodbye! And then they are kind of left. What did he say? Oh, okay. All right. When you read, you begin with A, B, C. When you sing, you begin with Do, Re, Mi, Do, Re, Mi, Do, Re, Mi. The first 3 notes just happen to be do, re, mi, do, re, mi, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Bop, 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 bop. What we think of in terms of medieval. Unless you happen to be somebody lucky, like say, oh no, I'm gonna have to look at my own channel, no. I'm gonna wait till that plane is done. Oh, squeezy. Okay, never mind, just never mind. Scratch that. Why are there so many planes? Why are there so many planes? It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Won't you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Won't you be mine? Okay.